War. Mr. Chairman.
Jan Logie.
In the committee stages of this bill, but I will start with some of the overarching points that are held within Part 1 of this Act, and I guess the first one is about this being a deterrent to asylum seekers, to address that general point of the purpose of this bill. And to remind this House, as I did in my first reading speech, that in the initial edition of this bill that we were presented with, there was nothing in the content of the bill that actually referred to people smugglers, apart from the declaration that that was the purpose of the bill. Within the content of it, there was nothing referencing people smugglers. And that within New Zealand law, we have legislation that specifically relates to people smuggling. And so you would think that actually if we were wanting to deter people smugglers, that actually that would be the place to start looking at our laws. And I would like to bring attention to this House how we've been using that law up to this point. That from 2004 to 2010, 15 people were convicted of people smuggling within New Zealand. And in none of those cases, to my knowledge, involved mass arrivals. So that's a key point. And that the people who were convicted of people smuggling under Section 98 of the Crimes Act have actually been treated pretty leniently in our courts. In fact, the harshest penalty in recent years has been 8 months home detention. 8 months home detention is the harshest penalty for people smuggling. And we're being told in this House that this is a heinous crime, that we need to break the consensus in this House on our commitment to the Refugee Convention because we need to deter these people. And yet, that has been the response in our courts to people smuggling. It really does beg the question whether this piece of legislation actually has anything to do with that point. And I would echo the call for the Minister to point out, in terms of this legislation, what evidence does he have that this piece of legislation will do anything to address people smuggling? I do note the more recent SOP that's come through from the Minister that does actually have some relationship with people smuggling, potentially, around the provision of documents to those that are seen as aiding and abetting people's entry into the country and providing of false documents. And when it comes to this point in reading this, I think it also brings us back to some of the complexity around asylum seeking. Because my strongest association with this, it takes me back to my childhood, where I was immersed in stories of the Second World War. And a huge number of those stories would be around the French resistance and the provision of documents to Jewish people or soldiers who had landed in places who needed a safe passageway to get out and to get to safety. And I was there as a child hearing those stories, just egging the resistance on to provide that, to get that false document for that person to get to safety. And in some ways, that's what we're talking about here. This is the lives of people whose very lives are at risk in completely war-torn countries and crises that we are actually, supposedly on the international stage intervening and standing up for these people. And yet, we're introducing legislation into this House that potentially limits their ability to get to safety. I don't understand it. I don't believe that is the New Zealand spirit. And when the previous chair of the Select Committee stood up and said that we on this side of the House are scaremongering around this bill and creating fear in migrant communities because they're never going to use this bill, then I have to remind him of the cause. But, Mr Chair.
Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr Chairman, New Zealand First takes people smuggling and border control